things change really quickly in your book when the three falls of Rome, and we very quickly charge towards a global Goliath, as it were. So explain, I guess, why that happened. And I have to admit and show you my cards. I'm using you here for my own selfish reasons. I'm frequently a debater on the Palestine Zionism question, and I put a lot of weight on the notion of the Palestinian cause as resistance to as an anti-colonial resistance movement, which of course I have to argue that Zionism then is an offshoot or offspring or whatever of European colonization. You have this chapter in your book that I was happy to read because it sort of, I think, endorsed a bit of my argumentation that capitalist colonization birthed from Europe is a new form of Goliath. Not the only evil in the world to my haters. It's not that brown and black people can't do evil things, and the book has plenty of that, obviously.
Yeah.
But that there is a specific historical epoch that starts pretty quickly after the fall of Rome that I think has paved the ground for that we're in today. I know I just asked you to cover a big stretch of your book, but if you could sort of respond to that and then tell me I'm right, that'd be great. No, just do your thing. Yeah.
No, precisely. So in the book, I point towards the fall of Rome as actually being quite critical in the emergence of colonial Europe and new colonial empires. And part of this is simply that Rome is exceptional. It's the only time in essentially history of Europe where you have a single polity in charge of the entire area. France under Napoleon gets pretty close, but their empire only actually spans that area for, I think, approximately 14 years, while Rome lasts for around about 500. But once Rome breaks up, you have all these different little polities, which are united by a similar Christian ideology, so they still have an ability to cooperate, but they're also constantly at war, competing, etc. And this creates massive innovation, particularly in things like gunpowder-based weaponry and new ways to navigate the globe, so shipping. And these end up being the important things to creating these new large colonial Goliaths. This is largely based upon the work of Walter Scheidel in his book,
The Great Leveler.
The Escape from Rome. This one's Escape from Rome,
yeah.
actually. Great Leveler is also great. I've drawn up on that as well. But this one's Escape from Rome in particular, which is basically about how the fall of Rome paves the pathway to modernity. But essentially, Goliath starts to go global. Once you have these new monopolized weapons in the form of musket-based weapons, and you have an ability to actually cross entire oceans, you start, of course, to see colonization. You have Europeans arriving both in the Americas and places like Australia and throughout Southeast Asia as well. The interesting thing here is, as you mentioned, this is a very clear case of, yes, colonization, but it's also a case of, interestingly, the elites at indigenous levels often being complicit in their subjugation. So one of the things I note, for instance, is in the case of the Aztecs, there's no way a small ragtag group of Spaniards managed to govern that entire place after they conquer it. Instead, they rely upon pre-existing elite networks. They basically just take the Aztec Empire and continue its forms of taxation, its elite economy, etc. But now with Spanish heads. And it's interesting that, for instance, if you go to the Real Palacio, the Royal Palace in Madrid, they actually have a statue of both Montezuma and Atahualpa as well, the head of the Incan Empire. And that's because to them, they actually became, in a way, part of the Spanish crown. Essentially, both the Aztec Empire and the Incan Empire become part of the Spanish crown, and even elites under those empires actually become part of the Spanish nobility as well. As far as they're concerned, those empires continued, they didn't collapse per se, but now under the colonial regime of the Spanish Empire. So there's an interesting wrinkle there, but this is often elites at a domestic level, also helping with the new colonial empire. But it's also quite clear that this new form of Goliath is in many ways far more brutal and much worse than what happened before. When you look at the conquests involved in the actual loss of life, it's just staggering. So for instance, in the case of the Basque of Mexico, roughly 90% of the population may have been lost. And granted, a lot of that is due to imported diseases, but it also seems to be not just the diseases, but warfare, slavery, and conditions that foster diseasing, including basically forcing people into close quarters. If you look at the invasion of Americas in general, maybe up to 10% of world population was lost due to that event, which would make it essentially the worst event by fatalities in global history. The Black Death may have come as close, but probably falls just a little bit behind.
Yeah. They I used to live in Madrid, and so I know this palace, and I went there a few times, and I don't know if you've been there, but if you also in the throne room, if you know the painting on the ceiling that had at the height of the Spanish Empire drawings, I'll put it on the screen now for people, all along the edge of the fresco of all of the corners of the Spanish Empire and the natives who were feeding into the thing. Yeah, and my point is like that again, it's not that European-led colonization fueled by this capitalist, maybe a status arms race in their heads, is a unique evil in the world as far as intention or whatever. But you can't. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there's just no equivalent to that in history before then. Again, this is not to say that brown and black people or Islamic, colonization of their ilk or the Ottomans or whatever weren't also involved, were Goliaths who were exploiting people to a degree. But this went global in such a profound way that, and I'm not going to ask you to debate Zionism here, but I think it's fair for people to count this as a historical epoch that is unique and has its unique kind of aggression, because it has paved the way for sort of where we're at today. So, but while we're on this European version of things, maybe I'm getting my history a little bit wrong here, but this is also the time that some historians kind of peg the nation state as an idea, or maybe a little bit before that, maybe the Westphalian Treaty and whatnot, that the nation state as an organizing principle, some people hinge it on Napoleon himself, and nationalism becomes the organizing unit that would be called your Goliath, or everybody, when they hear what you're talking about now, they're thinking states, they're thinking nation states, but that wasn't the case for most of human history. Is that right? Can you clear that up for me, and maybe why that happened in this nation state arrangement? Yeah.
So first of all, just for the record, it's true that this was unprecedented in scale, pace. When you essentially go from a world where empires probably do have the majority of humanity to one a couple of hundred years later where hunter-gatherers make up less than 5 or 1% of the global population. It's the ability for empires to spread with colonization was unprecedented. And you have entire continents which in a very, very short period of time go from not having a Goliath there, like North America or Australia, to being covered essentially by a single Goliath in polity. And for the record, free Palestine. I believe Israel's also committing genocide. Pretty clear cut.
We can get to that stuff at the end, but I'm sneaking up on it, but it's not why I wanted to talk to you in general, but that chapter I think is useful for my critics to engage with. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. In terms of nation states, I mean, in many ways, this just changing the way which we call things. Yeah. When we talk about states in archaeology or political science, we're referring to a set of centralized institutions which use violence to enforce rules and take resources from a given population. And that's something which occurred at least 5,000 years ago with the First Dynasty of Egypt. They've been around for a very long period of time. The only difference between that versus, say, for instance, nation states is really the label. Where suddenly you start to refer to it as nation state, because the idea is that the state, the kind of centralized governing apparatus, is also bound to a very particular type of nationality, a given ethnicity with a shared ancestry, language usually, etc. It comes from Latin nascor, which I believe means origin or something along those lines. That basically that's the entire idea, is we have some kind of shared origin. And nationalism was, of course, very prevalent in Europe during this time. So it just became a new way to start to justify your rule and your reign. Previously, most emperors and most conquerors often present themselves as stranger. There's often using this term as stranger kings, that essentially they came from elsewhere. And because of that foreignness, they were actually superior in some kind of way. The nation state was in many ways just a co-option of nationalist ideology to justify monarchy and to justify Goliath. But there's really no big difference here per se. If we look at, say, for instance, the nation state of France or the UK, they're empires, pretty clear cut. England expands to cover Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and eventually to, of course, develop the British Empire. But it is an act of empire and the actual borders we have today are the result of empire as well. Same as France. I mean, its essentially is Ile-de-France, basically central areas around Paris, incorporating a much larger one. And the borders, of course, vary with imperialism, but even the nation state of France is built upon empire. This is true of Germany, Prussian aggression, or Piedmontese aggression in the case of Italy, and the borders of places like of China. We'd be much more honest if we called it the United Empires of the world rather than United Nations, because essentially the difference between empire and state is really quite porous. As much as we call them nation states, the legacy here is imperial.
Yeah. I want you to underline psychologically that point about the sort of cooperation with local elites. And if you want, you could go back to what happened in Mexico, because I think that telling of the story is really important as well. Because is this... I guess why did they fall for it as well, or they were just sort of happy to sort of join the party? And is this the wrinkle in the situation that allowed it to go global, right? Like there was only so many Spaniards in the world. If they were going to try to cover the world with their own governors or whatever, I imagine they would get a little sloppy. Like you would need the buy-in of other, maybe, there's dark triad people in the Aztec Empire, I'm sure, who would be willing to be like, oh, cool, like I can be an elite here and get a cushy deal. Like if I don't know if you want to underline that point of the variable that allowed the European Goliath to go global. Was that the factor that really mattered? Or was it weapons? Or was it the disease or whatever? Or of course it's all of these things. I don't need you to pick, right? Yeah.
Yeah, of course it's all of them, but I do think that's a very large factor. I mean, there's areas of the world where you do not have pre-existing Goliaths, where you still have a Goliath eventually established. Australia being a great example, for instance. It's worthwhile noting in those cases, the conquest usually ended up being much more brutal. It wasn't just simply kind of severing and decapitating the empire and replacing the head. It was usually an act, essentially genocide, like in the case of Tasmania, for instance. I think it does substantially help when you have a centralized empire and you have a group of elites where you can just appeal to their interests. And they don't have to be dark triad. It could just simply be, if you want to keep your status and your elite position in society, then all you really need to do is start talking to and giving tribute to a Spanish king rather than an Aztec emperor. And in many cases, they probably even thought, well, with these people, at the very least, we don't know about them so much, but in this case, they may be better off than being under the control of Montezuma. But also, maybe they thought, well, these people are new. They might be a little bit naive. We can actually control them. We can manipulate them, etc. And in some cases, they were probably right, but in the longue durée for the entire society, they were definitely wrong. And I think that's another problem, of course, is that they probably weren't thinking, what does this mean for everyone in the long term? And it would have been very difficult for them to forecast if they had not experienced Spanish occupation, conquest, and brutalization previously. And it's worthwhile noting that even when you look at, say, for instance, decolonization, it's almost a similar-ish story where often the national movements are in many ways just a small group of elites often using nationalist rhetoric to justify a new system of power, which is why many of the new post-colonial regimes are still fairly autocratic, actually. They often adopt the actual structures left by the colonizers and essentially just perpetuate them. Not always, but frequently.
Yeah.
So,
no,
it's fortunately not a pretty picture, but
no, that's perfect. Because now I just want to go to the world wars and then where we are in now. So, how would you, in your story of Goliath and its collapse, and if sort of the height of that overt colonial picture of when Goliath went global from Europe, it seems to me, you write in these grand historical, narratives, World War I and World War II from some future historian might just get merged into the same event with like a little break in between of maybe some colonial world ripping itself into something else. I tend to think we're not done with that particular epoch, and hopefully there's not many more, and that's where we're going to get to collapse now. But how would you characterize World War I and World War II in relation to collapse and potentially a crisis for this Goliath going global? Because you've already sort of mentioned the post-World War II liberation movements and anti-colonial movements, which got popular. But I don't know how you call the world wars in that situation.
the world wars were mainly a battle for colonial
Yeah,
empire. Particularly World War II, we often frame as being this biblical struggle and clash between democracy and fascism, which just wasn't really the
right.
case. When you look at Germany, Japan, Italy, they were essentially empires without colonies, and they wanted more colonies, they wanted more resources, and unfortunately, it was the Brits, the Americans, and others who had most of those. And hence, the best way of getting their colonies was taking them by force. And as much as places like the UK may think of this as a battle for freedom and for democracy, it's pretty clear that they were quite happy to throw most of the Indian population under the bus, say, for instance, the Bengal famines. There was even instances where they basically shot a very large number of Indians who tried to hoist an England flag up, so an Indian flag up. So this wasn't really about
Yeah,
democracy whatsoever. This was about empire and about maintaining power. Eventually, yes, it became quite clear that the Nazi regime, the axis of evil, was genuinely evil, and it was much better off. You were much better off going for the Allies, but the motivation was not pure here. And in many ways, how I think about this is it ends up being the transition to the form of Goliath that we know
yeah,
today. So it's a transition away from the British Empire, essentially to the American Empire. It's a solidification of having one single global life. So what really happens with the transition to colonial empires is you start to see Goliath go global. And what happens with post-World War I and World War II is you really have an entrenchment of this new global Goliath. You have the establishment of things like the World Bank, the IMF, the Bretton Woods institutions, a new kind of global financial architecture to allow capital flow freely across different places. And while we tend to think of the world as being split up between different competing Goliaths, the US, China, Russia, which is true to some extent, it's noticeable that they have a surprising amount in common. Every single one is a political hierarchy with a head of state who goes to the UN. Every single one organizes their militaries in very similar ways and has nuclear weapons. Every single one is capitalist in some kind of basic way. In matter of fact, every single state in the world is capitalist. And notably, they all have pretty similar legal systems. Otherwise, you can't move capital across borders. And most of those legal systems are based upon either New York State property law or British Commonwealth law, because the British Empire and the American Empire are the ones who prevailed and basically spread their legal systems. And on top of all that, the use of information happens through a couple of big corporations, what we often call surveillance capitalist companies, Alphabet, Amazon, etc. And they're all global. So we do live under a single unified global Goliath, as I call it. And in many ways, its final birth was in that kind of post-World War II boom, what we often call the Great Acceleration.
yeah. Let's get to the Silicon Goliath to end it. But as an anecdote for that, in Amsterdam, our friends were just visiting the Museum of Tolerance, which they call, which is their museum.
Oh, interesting.
It's their museum of celebrating their resistance in World War II and all of this. But of course, the end of the museum is like, oh, and then by the way, we kept Indonesia for like another 15 years and subjugated them. It's like a little like anecdote, right? which is kind of the sick joke of, oh, we were fighting fascism in the world for the freedom of the world, but then America tried to also just take all the colonies as well. But so that is why, again, just to sort of put that like feather in my Zionist argumentation cap. We could argue about that. I could argue about that with Israel defenders all day. But that is the Goliath from which, like it or not, the Zionists, even if you think they needed a lifeboat and they did the best they could with whatever Goliath they had to find it, fine, I could have that moral argument. That is the Goliath which cooperated and built the Zionist problem that we have today. And so I do want to talk about October 7th. But before we get to that finish, your book...